10th grade biology class that I began to question the likelihood that two parents with dark hair would produce two redheads. And I remember asking my biology teacher how likely that was. And, he said, well, it's certainly possible with recessive genes, but it's not as common. And, you just don't know that kind of thing.
Hello, you are listening to NPE Stories. This is a podcast where NPEs can share their story. I am your host, Lily, and I found out I was an NPE through an ancestry DNA test that changed my life forever. NPE is a term that stands for not parent expected or non-paternal event. This means that one or more of our parents are not who we believe them to be. NPE Stories is a podcast where NPEs can share their story of what their original family was like, how they found out they were an NPE, and what their journey has been like since the day they found out. Welcome to episode 217. I listened to a webinar put on by Right to Know on Sunday, and it featured Megan Hunter, who I have brought up before, but I wanted to bring up this resource in case we have new listeners. Megan Hunter, she is a co-founder of the High Conflict Institute. I've heard her speak at the Untangling Our Roots Summit twice, and I was sitting in on her webinar on Sunday. And she just has some really helpful resources for NPEs. Megan founded the High Conflict Institute with Bill Eddy, and they have a podcast as well. I haven't listened to the podcast, but my husband listens to it every week, and a few other of my friends and NPs listen to it. It's called It's All Your Fault, High Conflict People Podcast. And it actually started as a way for co-parents to communicate with each other, especially in high conflict divorces. But we have found that the information they provide is really helpful for people in the NPE world, as well as the adoptee world, especially if within your family you have people with high conflict personalities. Maybe you're dealing with blame or manipulation or communication where people get angry or stonewall you. So she has a lot of interesting ideas in her website. I'll put the link down below, and feel free to check out that podcast. So thank you, Right to Know, for putting that on. You always have such great resources for us. And now we're going to get into listening to an NPE story today. And today we have on Annette. Hi, Annette.
Hi, Lily.
How are you doing today?
Oh, I'm great. It's really wonderful to be here.
And what part of the country are you in?
I'm in Richmond, Virginia.
Okay, all right. I'm in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Thank you so much for setting time aside this morning to do this.
Oh, I'm happy to do it. The work you do is really so important, so it's an honor to be here.
Oh, I appreciate that. And I took a little bit of a glance at the emails we've been sending over the last year, and I'm really interested to hear your story. Multiple father figures, which seems to happen a lot to us.
Yeah, we all know about those, right?
Okay, so let's get an idea of what your family of origin was like. This is your raising family, and feel free to tell us a little bit about your childhood.
Sure. Well, I think I would like to start by just saying that we were a Catholic family, and that's really, really important, I think, on the journey, because it was a critical part of my parents' upbringing and then my own story as a child, how much our Catholic faith was a part of our life. And so we were in Plymouth, Michigan when I was born. I was born in Ann Arbor. Plymouth is a little small town between Detroit and Ann Arbor. And both of my parents were born and raised in Detroit. And they were both, had done Catholic schools and Catholic churches and were active members of the church in Plymouth. When I was born in 1955, my mother's husband died when she was pregnant with me. So when I was born, she was a single mom. And I had a brother at that time who was about a year and a half older than me, almost 2 years older than me. So her husband died of a heart attack at the age of 47, and they had had another child, and that other child died of polio when she was 11, 6 years before I was born. And that too is kind of a critical part of the story. And I didn't really realize how much a part of it was until I began to reflect and put this whole picture together. Bob, who was my mother's first husband, never got over her death. And I really believe that it ultimately killed him. They had high medical bills to pay from her illness, and he had to cross a picket line at Michigan Bell to earn the money he could to pay them. And then when he died, I don't think he left much in the way of death benefits. I don't know what my mom lived on in those early years after Bob died, but I know that she needed some help to do that. As early as I can remember, Mom told us that Bob, our father, had died. There was never a question he was dead, but Mom never wavered from the story that he was our father. So our father died, as far as I knew, our father died, without me ever knowing him, and with my brother just knowing him as an infant. So during those years, the first 5 years of my life, there was another couple who were very, very instrumental, an important part of our life. We called them Uncle Norm and Aunt Betty. They were our godparents. So being my godfather was the first role that Uncle Norm played in my life. They owned a restaurant. Uncle Norm and Aunt Betty owned a restaurant in Plymouth, and we spent a lot of time there as kids. I loved the restaurant, and I really loved them, particularly Uncle Norm. When I was 5, my mom and my brother and I left Plymouth to move to Denver, Colorado. Uncle Norm had sold the restaurant and moved to Denver to work as a salesman for Daisy BB guns. You probably remember Daisy, and still may have one in your family. But I was too young to understand what was happening. But I distinctly remember being on the train from Ann Arbor to Denver. Mom had told us that we were going to go live with Uncle Norm. I didn't really know what that meant, but I remember when we were close to our destination, Mom looked at my brother and me directly in the eyes. I can still see her like holding on to, our shoulders. And as we're standing there together on this bouncing train, and she said, "When we arrive in Denver, you can call him Dad." And that moment was just, carved into my brain what that meant. I was just overjoyed. I remember what it felt like to kind of worm myself into the center of their hug every time they would joke about the fact that they couldn't hug without me being in the middle of it. But I was just so happy to have a dad and to have Uncle Norm as our dad. So a man who started out as our godfather had now become our dad. He was a stepdad, but he was still our dad. A year later, after we moved to Denver, and I was in first grade, we celebrated when our new dad adopted us. I remember going out to eat after leaving this big courthouse building in downtown Denver. Again, I didn't really understand what was happening, but I knew Mom and Dad were happy about it, so I was happy about it. So now this man who had been my godfather and then a stepdad was now my adoptive father. He was our dad. As I said, we were really too young to remember Bob. I wasn't even born yet, so I had no way to remember him. So Norm was the only father that we knew. And he was a great dad. We spent a lot of our childhood, those couple years in Denver. He would travel around the Western Territory, Western states, and we would travel with him. I got to see a lot of the West. And in 1960, it was still really the Old West in a lot of ways. And I cherished that time. But 2 years later, just 2 years in Denver, we moved again, and this time to Rogers, Arkansas. My mother thought it was the end of the world. She couldn't believe she was moving to, to Arkansas, of all places. But Daisy had moved their headquarters there from Plymouth, Michigan to Rogers, Arkansas. And Dad had received a promotion, so he needed to work from the home office. So we joined him there. Of course, we joined the local Catholic church, and my brother and I enrolled in the Catholic school. You know, we're probably 80% of the residents of Rogers were Baptist. We kind of stood out as we were the Catholic kids. But besides the church and the school, the only really obvious difference between my family and that of my friends was that our parents were considerably older. My mom was 42 when I was born, and my dad was 7 years older than that, so he was 49 at the time I was born. That meant by the time we were in high school, Mom was in her late 50s, Dad was in his 60s. So for a lot of our friends, they were like the age of our grandparents. But still, our home life was relatively happy. Dad still traveled for his job, and he was gone a lot of the time. Mom stayed home in a traditional housewife role, taking care of the kids in the house and volunteering at the hospital and at school. But as I grew older, I grew more curious about Bob, our father, and I'd never seen a picture of him. I never saw an image. I never knew what it was, what he looked like. And I was curious about Marley, my sister who had died. Mom would mention her now and then and would, maybe tell a story in as long as it was just Mom and me in the room. She never said anything in front of my dad. I never had seen a picture of her either. So it just seemed kind of strange. And, I got to be 10, 11, 12 years old, and I started to get curious about who these people were that were such a critical part of my life and my story in some ways. So I want to just share a brief excerpt from the memoir that I wrote, Living into the Truth, that tells a little bit about that. This is my mother talking. Your dad made me throw away all the pictures I had of Marley and Bob, she said, as she shuffled through a stack of photos of Jarrett and me when we were little. He what? I asked. I wasn't sure I'd heard her right. He wanted to be your only dad so badly. He didn't want any reminders of what it was like before him, she replied. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. That's why I'd never seen a picture of my father, Bob, and why I'd never seen one of my sister. Her eyes shifted down and then around. I kept one, she said, her voice sounding like she was confessing a sin in the confessional booth. Although we were alone in the house, she looked around to make sure no one else could see her. She walked over to her dresser, eased open the middle drawer, the one where she kept her sweaters. She dug down underneath them and pulled out a weathered photograph. This one is from right before she got sick, she said. Her eyes reddened. That was the closest I'd ever seen her come to crying. She handed the photo to me like it was one of those Catholic relics Dad kept in his dresser, a relic of the true cross or a piece of some saint's bone. So that excerpt shows a little of my beginning to question and a little of the secrets that surrounded my childhood. I was shocked by the revelation that Dad had made her throw away these pictures. And it was the first time I remember being angry at my dad. I couldn't understand how he could do such a thing or why. It just didn't make any sense. I mean, these were important parts of her life. We knew about Dad's life. We knew Aunt Betty, his first wife, we knew his family. But it just seemed bizarre that he had shut down this part of the life. But at the same time, in some ways it did make sense because there was so much in my childhood that I come to understand now was really shaped by the grief of my sister's death and around that secrecy of Bob's role in her life. Those were just things we did not talk about. So there was a lot of emotional restraint. I remember my mother used to, if I would get upset about something, she would say, go to your room until you can come out with a smile on your face. that was, it was not okay to be upset. And so, although love existed, the silence and control that silence created really dominated who we were as children growing up. And our Catholic faith really reinforced that shame and that secrecy. I remember the day when I heard that Aunt Betty had died. I didn't know whether or not to be sad. I felt sad, but I wasn't sure I could express that emotion. So I really didn't express anything. I just kind of watched. I watched my parents to see what they would do and how they reacted. And I remember waking up on a Saturday morning just after we had heard that news, and Mom and Dad were gone. Well, that never happened. That never happened before. We didn't understand what that was about. And when they came back, they were all dressed up. And that was even more strange on Saturday morning. What were they doing dressed up? But they wouldn't tell us where we'd been. Well, I was kind of a curious kid, probably described as nosy. I was going to find out. And it didn't take me too long to discover where they had gone. I'd seen Mom put some papers into the filing cabinet at the end of the hallway on the floor of the closet. So I snuck in there to see what those papers were. And I found that they had gone to get married by the priest. So we had, this was in the late 60s. So we had lived with Dad for maybe 8 years or so, 8 or 9 years, but they had not been married by the priest. And up until that point, they were considered living in sin because a divorced man couldn't remarry. But now that Betty was dead, they could receive communion and the other sacraments because they were married in the church. What I didn't know until I started researching my family in more recent years is that they hadn't been legally married either for the first couple of years we lived in Denver. I suspect that they probably had to wait until their divorce, Dad and Aunt Betty's divorce, had become final before they could legally marry. So they were really living in sin then. As far as we knew, they were Helen and Norm Marquis, and they presented themselves that way to everybody that we knew, but they were not legally married yet. The other theme that I think was definitely a part of my childhood was the fact that my brother and I both had red hair. Now, that may not seem like it's a big deal, but it really was a big deal to me, and it really became a critical part of this journey. Remember, I'd still never seen a photo of Bob, but Mom had told me that just like Marley, he had black hair, just like my sister. So Mom's hair was silver gray by the time I was a kid, but her hair had been dark too. Norm, on the other hand, our new father, had red hair. He was mostly bald by the time we joined him in Denver, and certainly by the time we were in Arkansas. And what hair he had mostly lost any color that it had, but there was really no question that he had been a redhead. In fact, his brother went by the name Red, and Dad's hair was equally red. So, when we were kids, our hair was the first thing that people noticed about us, my brother and me. And we'd meet adults, and they'd say, "Oh, where did you get your red hair?" Well, what's a kid supposed to say to that? And so I started saying, "Well, from our dad, he has red hair." So it was kind of the first lie I remember telling, because he wasn't our real dad. As far as I knew, he wasn't our dad. But it made me feel like we were more of a normal family. Like Norm was our real father who had passed on his curly red hair to his children. He wanted to be seen as our real dad, and so answering that way really kind of made it that we were the family. We were his kids. But it was this little lie that really became the first loose thread in the unraveling of the family secret. It was my trying to figure out how we had red hair that kind of created, the questions as a child. So all in all, my childhood was happy. We lived kind of a, middle class life. We traveled a fair amount with my dad still. We did, all the kinds of things that my friends did. But there was this secret. And it took me many more years to figure out where that came from.
So, Annette, how did you find out you were an NPE?
Well, that's a very long story. I mean, it took a lot of years. The suspicions started with the red hair stuff, but it was, the 10th grade biology class that I began to question the likelihood that two parents with dark hair would produce two redheads. And I remember asking my biology teacher how likely that was. And, he said, well, it's certainly possible with recessive genes, but it's not as common. And, you just don't know that kind of thing. But my friend Nancy and I, now we're teenagers, and we're kind of imagining who our parents really are, and we would spend hours spinning stories about how Norm could really be my biological father. I didn't believe it was true because we'd been told our entire lives that Bob was our father, but it was fun to try to figure out, how did it happen? How could it have happened? We would just, we would laugh and spend time trying to figure out what different scenarios might exist. And when I got my birth certificate, I had to order a copy of birth certificate. For some reason, I didn't need one to get into college, but there was something I was doing while I was in college that required a birth certificate. And I got my birth certificate, and I was somewhat dismayed. I remember feeling dismayed to see that it had been altered, that Norman W. Marquis was listed as my biological father. And it was dated 1962, which means the year that I got adopted by him. So I understand now that it wasn't an uncommon practice, and maybe it still is not an uncommon practice, that birth certificates are altered when a child's adopted. Yeah, I remember saying, well, that's kind of weird because he's not my father. He's not my father. Why does my birth certificate say he's my father? And it felt like it had really erased the man that my mother had told me was my father, who I still didn't know much about, but it was just one of those touch points where I thought, well, this is weird. But honestly, it wasn't until I was in my early 50s, so a long time later, that the questions resurfaced. I really kind of, I put them aside. I didn't think about it much. It was just, there was a story we were told. Bob was our father. He died. Mom married Norm. He became our adopted father. That was the story. But then I got a call from a woman who identified herself as my sister's best friend when they were kids. In fact, she was with her the night that she came down with polio, was sleeping in the same bed with her, and didn't get sick.
Wow.
And Marcia's parents allowed Marcia to stay with my sister through her illness, including, when my sister was in an iron lung in the house. She was the first, as I understand it, she was the first person to have an iron lung at home in the 1940s. And Marcia would be the one kid who would be allowed to come to visit. All the other families would keep their kids away because, this contagious disease, and they didn't want anybody to have contact. But Marcia's parents let her visit. And maybe they thought, well, she was exposed, she didn't get it, she's probably immune, whatever the reason. But Marcia had been searching for me for several years. And the story is kind of bizarre. She had been looking for me because she found, as she was going through her things, now she's a woman in her 60s, and she and her husband were going to sell their house and go RVing, and they didn't, she was getting rid of possessions, and she came across this bracelet that my mother had made. She said my mother made it. I suspect that somebody else made it, and my mom gave it to her. But it was a bracelet of Catholic medals that kids had brought and left on the doorstep when Marley was home with the iron lung. So it was this kind of a charm bracelet of sorts that was all of the Catholic medals of saints and the Virgin Mary and so forth. And Marcia had wanted to take this bracelet and bury it at the cemetery where Marley was buried. And when she got there, she discovered that Marley didn't have a headstone. And she was quite disturbed by that and wanted to buy her a headstone, and the cemetery wouldn't let her do that. They said it had to be a blood relative. So she spent 3 years trying to track me down. She could have looked on the internet and found me in about 5 minutes, but she was not tech savvy, and so she ordered birth certificates and marriage certificates and talked to cousins that I hadn't talked to my entire life and or barely, tried to track me down, and she finally found me. And so she wanted me to help her buy a headstone for Marley. And I said, okay, that sounds reasonable. I had heard Marcia's name before by my mom. I knew that, she wasn't a con artist trying to get me to give up some money or whatever. I wasn't sure, but I didn't remember ever meeting her. I did when I was a little kid, and but I just remember Mom mentioning her and mentioning her parents, and I knew that her parents had been best friends of Mom and Bob. And Mom had one time she was visiting me in Michigan. I moved back to Michigan from Arkansas when I was a young adult, and she asked me if we could try to track down this couple because she wanted to reconnect with them. Remember that, it was not only the photographs that Norm had said he didn't want in her life, but any contact with anybody from that time in her life. He forbade her from having any contact. So she had lost track of this couple, but Norm died. He died in 1977. So I was just like just early 20s. And Mom came to visit me and wanted to try and track this couple down. Well, they had moved to Florida by then, so we never got together with them. But in any event, this, Marcia, it seemed like a legitimate connection. So I went to visit her, and we bought the headstone. We got the headstone installed. And in fact, I installed one on Bob's grave too, because he hadn't had a headstone either. So we got that done. And I went back to visit her, and I said to her, I know that your parents and my parents were best friends, and that something happened, and I don't know what it was, but something happened. And I still remember the moment when she said, "Do you want to know?" And I looked at her, and at this point, again, I'm now in my 50s. I've lived a whole life not really investigating this story. And I said, yeah, I'd sure, I want to know. And I didn't really expect that it would affect me much at all. But her first word after she looked at me for a minute, trying to decide whether or not to say, she said, Norm is your real father. And I just kind of took it in. I was very cool. I didn't, overreact. But she went on to tell me the story that her father had told her. And that story was that after Marley died, Bob went into a deep depression, and that Mom separated from him. Apparently it was pretty bad, and Mom separated. Well, while she was separated, she got pregnant. And being, respectable Catholic couple, Bob took her back in. That's the way Marcia said it. Bob took her back. And so they got back together. My brother was born. And that after my brother was born, and remember that now Norm and, who were then Uncle Norm and Aunt Betty, became his godparents. So I have home video of Mom and Bob and Aunt Betty and Uncle Norm at my brother's baptism. But then he got very depressed again. There was some indication that maybe he was abusive, but I don't know that that's the case. I have no evidence of that, no indication of that had ever happened. But she left him again, and this time had decided to divorce him. Now, you can imagine that a good Catholic mother in the 1950s, somebody who didn't like to make waves or bring attention to herself, somebody who was the consummate caregiver, to consider divorce, things had to have been pretty serious. But she apparently left and was considering divorce, and she got pregnant again. And Bob took her back again. So they were together when he died. And a bizarre part of the story, remember that Norm owned a restaurant. Well, the story is that Bob's heart attack happened in the restaurant. It was a Sunday morning brunch, and they had come from church to go to the brunch, and he had a heart attack and died before he got to the hospital. So Bob was gone. Mom was pregnant. Still, she was 4 months pregnant, I think. I was born, and again, home video, 8mm video, shows Uncle Norm and Aunt Betty being a very significant part of our lives. They were there at Christmas. They were there, in 4th of July parties, celebrations, parades, all that kind of stuff. But it hit Bob's death, then freed Mom up to marry Norm. Now, Mom always said to me that it was Bob that she really loved, that she married Norm because she needed a father for the kids and she needed the money, needed somebody that could take care of the family, and that's why she married Norm. So in the few, brief times that Mom said anything in my childhood, that was the message. But she did that. So that was the story from Marcia. And I wasn't sure, her father had told her the story, apparently on his deathbed, because it was one of the regrets that he had in his life, that he had lost contact with Mom, that he had blamed her. And that, Marcia said it was because they were a strict Catholic family too, and that they had, she had now gotten pregnant twice out of wedlock, and that was a problem. So it felt like it was a true story, but I still didn't have any evidence. I just kind of held that. I shared it with my brother, and my brother and I at that point in our lives really didn't talk about a lot of family stuff very often. But he told me that when Mom was dying, and she was dying in his house, she came and lived at his house, he asked her if Norm was our father, and she denied it right up to the end. So I still only had this story. I then shared it with my mom's best friend. My mom was definitely, she had died in 2002. So this was in 2006 or so. So it was 4 years after Mom had died. So she was gone. But her best friend was still alive. And so I shared the story with her. And she responded by saying, I always knew that there was some secret. that there was something that your mother wouldn't tell, and that I didn't push her on it because I wanted her to not feel like she had to lie to me or tell me something that wasn't true or whatever. So I just didn't push it. She said, I don't know what the story was, but it was her belief that it was a much more open arrangement than Marcia had projected. She had really believed that Bob, after Marley had died, they had gone, Marley was 11 when she died, and then it was 5 more years later before my brother was born. And so that's a long spell, 16 years between kids, if it had been Bob's. And so my mother's friend believed that perhaps it had been an open arrangement, that Bob couldn't have more kids, and that Norm had always wanted kids and hadn't had them. And so they did a open kind of communicated about it and did an open arrangement where Norm had these 2 kids for his friend Bob, because they were friends. They were friends too. I don't believe that was necessarily the story, but Mom's friend believed it because she couldn't believe that her friend would sin that way by having sex, out of marriage. So that was her explanation of it. But again, so it's 2006, and I didn't know what else to do with the story. But then DNA kind of, started becoming more available, DNA testing. And so I thought, well, I would really like to know if my brother is my full biological brother. Maybe he was Bob's kid and I was Norm's. That maybe I could understand, that she had had one affair. It didn't make sense that she could have had 2, but I would allow that maybe she had one. But my brother and I look so much alike, we could be twins. From the time we were little kids, people thought we were twins. He acts like me. We have a lot of the same interests. But I wanted to know, was he in fact my full biological sibling? So I asked him if he would take a DNA test. So we both took tests with 23andMe, and it came back that he was my full biological sibling. So I was relieved to hear that, because relieved and then also more confused, because what did that say about whether Marcia's story was true? It sounded like maybe she was right, but I still didn't know what to do with that. So I decided to contact a nephew of my dad's, of Norm's, to contact a nephew and ask him if he would take a DNA test. And he agreed. He didn't have any interest in knowing the results. He didn't have any interest in seeing the test or anything, but he spit into the tube and sent it off for me. Well, I wasn't sure what it would show, but I knew that if my cousin was related to me in any way, then Norm had to have been our father. And if he wasn't related, then it was a pretty good indication that he probably wasn't. So he took the test. I waited for the results. I remember sitting at my desk. I was more nervous about that than I was the test that my brother took, because I knew he was related to me in some way. So I remember opening the test and finding that he was my full cousin, first cousin. Mm. So I want to share another excerpt from my book about when I learned the news. But I just want to take a minute to say, here is this man who, I have shared before. He was my godfather. He turned my stepfather, then my adoptive father, and now to find out he was my biological father. So I almost named my memoir 4 Fathers in One. because it just seemed too incredulous to be true.
Wow.
But so here's a brief excerpt from when I learned the news. I now had irrefutable proof that Norm was my biological father, was our biological father. Everything I'd questioned, everything I'd imagined, everything I tried to understand came down to this. I'll never know how. DNA doesn't reveal the how, but I no longer have any room to doubt the truth. I couldn't blame my parents for what they did. I knew how people, including myself, can find themselves in untenable situations. I didn't and still don't blame them for that. I do blame them, though, for what they did with it. I could feel the heat rise in my face, my muscles tensing, my jaw tightening. Jarrett and I deserved to know who our father was, and we deserved to know it from our parents. My anger, however, quickly turned to grief. The corners of my eyes tightened. The tears started rolling down my cheeks. Maybe it had just gone on too long. Maybe it was because I had finally accepted the truth. Whatever the reason, I pressed my folded arms against my stomach and let my body convulse into tears. I cried for Marley. I cried for Bob. I cried for my mother's grief and for her torment at having to live a lie. I cried for Norm, the man who could never tell his children, the children he loved so much, that he was their father. But most of all, I cried for me. I cried for all the times I didn't cry, all the feelings I didn't let myself feel, and all the things I never knew because of my parents' secrets. So that's how I found out.
It's very rare to have a full biological sibling.
Yeah, yeah,
Of course,
that's right.
you knew no different. That's what you'd always suspected. But
That's what we always believed to be
right.
true, but I did have to know.
Yes.
I did have to know.
Oh. Mm.
Yeah. So that my mother would have 2 children by the same man outside of her marriage.
And your mother never gave any indication that she never admitted this to your brother or to you?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. She did everything to hold that. There was one time when I knew when she was really upset about something, I don't even know what. And I remember her saying, "If you only knew the things I've done." That was another working title for my memoir, If You Only Knew. Because, and I can feel her anguish and her pain, but she never exposed it.
And so often when NPEs find out they have a different biological father, they don't have necessarily any connection, maybe like a family friend. But here,
Right.
Norm was, as you just explained it, godfather, stepfather, adopted father, and biological father. So I'm assuming you already have connections with his side of the family.
Yeah, absolutely. I knew his mother. It was the only grandparent I knew was his mother. And in fact, although I don't know for sure, there's rumors that I was named after her. My name is Annette. Her name was Anne. And she always called me Little Anne. So, I never asked where that came from. I did kid my mother when I was a young adult because my Bob's last name was Smith and my middle name is Suzanne, so my initials were ASS until she married Norm.
Okay, so your last name changed with the adoption.
With the adoption,
Yep,
right?
that makes sense.
Yeah. It changed really when we moved to Denver.
Yeah.
We were we presented to the world as a family, as the Marquis family. Even though now I know that they weren't legally married and we hadn't been adopted by him. We presented to the world as if we were.
So are you pretty certain that it sounds like Bob knew you weren't his children and your brother?
I don't know for certain.
Right.
Marcia says he knew, but I have no way to know that.
Yep.
I have no way to know.
Yeah.
And, if he did consent to it, like my mom's friend believes he did, then that puts a different light on it too. But as far as I know from Marcia's story, which feels perhaps like it's the real story, he must have known because she would leave, get pregnant, and he'd take her back in.
Did any of Bob's family play a part in your life?
Well, that's a very interesting question. There was one time, well, a couple times. So Bob's brother was a judge. He lived in Michigan. And when I was in school, my name had gotten into the paper for being on the honor roll. And he saw my name. I went to my last 2 years of high school at a Catholic boarding school in Michigan. So I was still in high school. He saw my name in the paper and he reached out to me. And he told me who he was, and he would love to come meet me. Well, we had met before because apparently, as a young kid, I think that he and his wife were some of the ways that Mom survived after Bob died. I think that they even may have lived together for a time. I'm not sure of that, but I went and met him and his wife, and no indication at that point that there was anything other than, my father, Bob, had died and this was his brother. And then there was one other time when Mom came to visit me in Michigan, and I had arranged for us to go there so that she could reconnect with Bob's brother. And we're driving to the house. I see Mom looking out the window and at this girl riding a bike, and Mom turned like white as a ghost, absolutely white. And I said, Mom, what's wrong? What's wrong? Are you okay? And she said, that's Marley. That's Marley on the bike. And we'll come to find out it was a grandkid, or a great grandkid, maybe even, who was out for a ride near the house where we were going. So we went to this dinner, and Bob's, I still say my father because that was like so ingrained into me, but it wasn't. So Bob's brother was there, and his daughter was there, and son-in-law, I think, and then this little girl. And I remember looking at my cousin and thinking for the first time I saw somebody who looked like me on, that had my eyes. And so I believed that reinforced the idea that Bob was really my father. But it was not true.
Yeah.
It was not true. It was just some fantasy I'd created for myself. But her daughter was a spitting image for Marley.
Oh, wow. Oh.
Yeah.
Now, what have you done since finding out you were an NPE that you found to be healing, cathartic in processing all of this?
Well, it was interesting because I was going through. I'm not even sure I had the DNA tests yet. I'm pretty sure I hadn't. But I had decided that I wanted to do more with creative writing. I had been a tech writer. I'd written a bunch of technology books, but I had not spent a lot of time in my adult life as doing creative writing. And so I enrolled in an MFA program in creative writing. And I remember sitting at lunch one day at a table with a number of students and faculty who had all been adopted. And they had just gathered together for lunch to kind of share their adoption stories. And I don't know how I ended up at the table. I just kind of fell into the group. And so they're telling their adoption stories. And, one was adopted from Korea, and another, had been adopted when her parents had died, and another, there were just all the different kinds of stories, including a woman who had given a child up for adoption. and she was reconnecting with her son who she had given up for adoption. So all these stories were flying, and I said, well, I have kind of a unique twist on an adoption story. I was raised by an adopted father who I found out was my biological father. And they're like, what? And their immediate response is, you've got to write that. Well, I hadn't even thought about writing that. That wasn't in my frame at all, about writing about this story. But I began to think about it, and I thought, well, all right, I'll try to write something about it. And I started writing about Marley because, her story was just such I refer to her as kind of the ghost of my childhood. Her story was just so much there and haunting. And so I started writing about her, and I ended up writing, as part of the program, I had to write a creative thesis. And so I wrote the initial round of the story for that. But I still wasn't certain. I still didn't have the DNA testing. I'm pretty certain I'm saying that I'm telling the truth about that. I think that came in later. But I finished the story. I finished my program. I went on and did other kinds of writing. But I just wasn't settled that this book was done. So I let it sit. And that was in 2013. I published the book in 2024. So over those years, I would pull it out and I would write a little bit on it. I would rewrite it. I would start it over. I would try some different techniques with it. And I still didn't quite have it right. And I realized that a big part of my identity, and one of the major conflict points with my parents, particularly my mother, because my father died, as I said, when I was only 22, so I was still kind of coming into my adulthood. But for my mother, a major conflict point was when I came out as a lesbian. And I built a life of secrets around my identity for many years, even though my mother knew, but we didn't talk about it. It was another place where we could hold secrets. And when I finally decided in the late 90s that I was going to be out, and that was it, that became a critical place for me in really coming to terms with what does it mean to live in the open? What does it mean to live authentically, to live the truth, to not be caught up in lies and secrets and who knows what, and not be caught up in the tension that happens when you bring up a subject that people don't quite want to talk about. And so my coming out was very much a part of my healing of my family story, is coming to grips with that, and the freedom that really it has allowed me to be truthful about who I am. So writing the book in a broad sense of what it helped me to focus on in terms of my journey was very healing for me in ways that I didn't expect, because I ended up with a structure for the book that interwove those stories, my parents' secrets, my secrets, exposing their secrets, and my coming out story are kind of the three major parts of the memoir. So that helped me, I think, to begin to see it as part of a bigger whole. So in one of the iterations of the memoir, I was rethinking how the structure was. I was rethinking about, what I wanted to include. And I started writing some letters to my mother. My mother's had long passed, but I wrote 4 letters to my mother. And this is the 4th letter, and kind of the end of that series of things. And I inserted those letters as the prologue to the book, but I think you'll see how it really is kind of the end. I want to start by saying that, I didn't represent my mother as somebody who really loved humor, but she did. She loved laughing at things, and so laughter was a big part of our life together. So this letter refers to that, but this is just the ending of that. It's been a few years now since I learned as much as is knowable about your secrets. In that time, I've come to realize that my pain is not as much from you as it is about you. It's from knowing the freedom of living in the truth, a freedom you never afforded yourself. I wish I could give that to you. I wish I could let you know that I know. I wish we could talk about it. So you know I forgive you for lying to me about who I am. I'm not saying I've come to this place easily. I'm not saying I'm not angry about what you did. I'm not saying I'm not hurt that you lied to me. I am saying that I wish you could know the freedom that comes from living in the truth. I wish you still had the chance to forgive yourself. I even wish we could find a way to laugh about it. Something in all this must be funny.
Annette, if people wanted to read this memoir or get in touch with you, know more about you, what is the best way to do that?
There are two places. One is a Substack newsletter that I write that is under AnnetteMarquis.com. And the other is how I publish the book, which is wordswomenpress.com. Wordswomenpress.com. So either of those places will get you to the book. I first published the book as a serialized format on my Substack. So paid subscribers can still see it there, but it also has links to purchasing the book.
Oh, I love this. I love how you've chosen to live your life in your authentic self. And thank you so much for coming on and sharing all this. And I just really enjoyed listening to you today.
Oh, thank you. Thank you again, Lily, so much, and for all that you do to lift up NPE stories. It's just so important that we have a place to tell our stories and to hear other stories. So thank you.
These stories are here for us to identify with. If you are an NPE and would like to share your story, email npestories@gmail.com. You do not have to give any identifying information. If you are an NPE and would like to share your story, I'd like to hear from you. Subscribe to this podcast to hear more. Come heal with us.